Thanks for taking the time to understand the new features and changes in Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2015. My name is Josh Wells, and during this training, we will cover two new field types, calculated and roll-up fields. Within previous versions of Microsoft Dynamics CRM, to do calculations required a developer or some advanced customizations knowledge. With the release of Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2015, additional functionality has been introduced to help with calculations within Microsoft Dynamics CRM. As mentioned, in the previous versions of Microsoft Dynamics CRM, calculations required developer support to achieve these types of results. It required additional code to be written and deployed through plugins, JavaScript, etc. This additional code requires developer to maintain and update them, which causes additional costs. As more records are recreated in Microsoft Dynamics CRM, and as the business logic in these calculations evolve, there's a higher risk for performance degradation. With the release of Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2015, two new fields are being introduced to help with some of the more common calculations done in CRM now. First, we will cover calculated fields, and later in this training we will cover roll-up fields. Roll-up fields and calculated fields can be used independently or complementary to each other. Calculated fields let you, as a system customizer, define the value of that field by using calculation operators or functions. A developer no longer needs to write code to accomplish such a task. The calculated fields comprise of calculations that use fields from the current entity or related entities. For example, a salesperson may want to know the weighted revenue for an opportunity, which is based on the estimated revenue for an opportunity multiplied by the probability. Or they want to automatically apply a discount if an order is greater than $500. Calculated fields are not limited to numeric fields. For instance, a calculated field can set a phone number for an opportunity based on the count or contact information. They can also work with date fields as well. A calculated field can contain values resulting from a various amount of operators. Let's take a look at what consists of a calculated field. Calculated fields are very flexible in the terms of what data types are supported. As one can see, all but 4 data types are supported as a calculated field. Once a data type has been defined, and the field type has been set to calculated, clicking on Edit creates the field and the data type is no longer editable. Creating a calculated field uses the same editor as the business rules or business process flows. The editor has been enhanced in this version of Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2015. The enhancements are covered in the business rules portion in the Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2015 training. The addition of if, else condition operators as well as the and or logical operators are covered in more detail in that training. Please review that for more details and limitations of the actual editor. One of the added functionalities of the editor, specifically for calculated fields, is IntelliSense. This allows a system customizer to type in the logical or display name of field or function and get suggestions of that available field or function similar to what has been typed. When setting the value of a calculated field, you have the ability to choose different functions or operators that allow the data to be modified in certain ways. We'll quickly cover the different functions and operators available based on data types. The math operators are typical math operators, so we won't really go into them here. The string functions are concat, trim left, trim right. Concat will add single lines of text together. These could be fields or actual lines of text. If using lines of text, the text will need to be encased with double quotes. For instance, we want to concatenate the contact's first name and the account name. If we simply concatenate those two fields, it will show Sydney, Blue, Yonder, Airlines, without a space between Sydney and Blue. You can see here a space was added in between the two fields. Trim left takes a single line of text and trims that number of characters starting from the left and working its way to the right. In this case, you can see we are trimming 7 characters from the left of the account name, taking Blue Yonder Airline sample and making it Ender Airline sample. Trim right takes a single line of text and trims that number of characters starting on the right and working its way to the left. We can see that sample has been removed from the right of the account name. Finally, we will cover date time, which is going to take a date time and either add or subtract the specified numbers of hours, days, weeks, months, or years. It is important to know that the available functions and operators do not work like they do in Microsoft Excel, nor does the value editor for calculated field. Essentially, what you see is what you get. The condition expression as well as the action operators work with many-to-one relationships. If a parent record is used in the calculation, but the parent record is null, the value of the calculated field also becomes null. Now that we've covered the calculated field a bit, let's take a look at what this looks like within Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2015. Now that we're in Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2015, Let's create a new calculated field for the opportunity entity. In order for us to understand the usefulness of calculated fields, let's come up with a scenario. The sales manager wants to understand the performance of your sales team. To do that, he asks you, the CRM customizer, to create a field within CRM that will monitor the weighted revenue of an opportunity. The weighted revenue calculations are estimated revenue times probability. Let's now accomplish this task. To do this, we'll go ahead and go into Microsoft Dynamics CRM and Settings, Settings, Customizations, and Customize the System. Now let's go ahead and expand Entities, Opportunity, and click on Fields, and click on New. Let's go ahead and set the name for this for weighted revenue, the data type to currency, and the field type to calculated. You'll notice when setting the field type to calculated that a couple things happen. One, auditing is not enabled or cannot be enabled for calculated fields. Two, we have this edit option. This is the editor for the calculated fields. Clicking on edit will actually create this calculated field, but the definition for the field will be empty. Now this takes us into the calculated field editor. We want to make sure we're only calculating weighted revenues for open opportunities. To do that, we must set a condition to if status equals open. To set a condition, go ahead and click on Add Condition. Current entity status equals open. Now that we have that defined, let's go ahead and specify our logic. To do that, we'll go ahead and click on Add Action. Here is where we're going to go ahead and set the logic for our field. We wanted weighted revenue calculations, our estimated revenue, times the probability. So let's go ahead and start typing in estimated revenue. You'll notice that we started getting IntelliSense to come up. I'm going to go ahead and click on estimated value and the operator, math operator of times, and start typing in probability. Now we have weighted revenue defined of estimated value or estimated revenue times the probability. Let's go ahead and save this. Let's go ahead and save this as well. Now let's go ahead and see this in action. We want to make sure that all three of those fields are on the form so that we can actually see the calculations on the field. So let's go ahead and go to Forms under the Opportunity entity and click on Opportunity. Now we have this open. Just for the ease of things, I'm going to go ahead and insert a new tab. Now inside this tab, I'm going to go ahead and add the estimated revenue, probability, and weighted revenue. Okay, now that I have those three fields set in my weighted revenue tab, I'm going to go ahead and save and publish this. Let's go ahead and look at this within Microsoft Dynamics CRM. We define the weighted revenue for the opportunity entity, so let's go there. I'll go ahead and click on my home, go to Sales, Opportunities, and now what I'm going to go ahead and do is open up one of my existing opportunities. Now that we have this opportunity open, let's go ahead and go to our new tab here, and you can see the estimated revenue is $25,000, and there's no probability. Well, since the estimated revenue is $25,000 and the probability is null, the weighted revenue value is null as well. What happens if I define something within the probability? Well, let's check that out. I'm going to go ahead and set this as a probability of 50%. You'll notice that after clicking off of the probability, that the weighted revenue is not calculated. The reason is because the changes are unsaved. Now, if I go ahead and force the save by clicking on the Save button or using the hotkey of Control S, we'll see that the weighted revenue is going to calculate. Right after clicking on the Save icon, the weighted revenue has been calculated to 1.25 million. That's the whole idea with calculated fields. Now let's go back and discuss some of the other properties of calculated fields. Calculated fields are read-only. The core definition of a calculated field is doing calculations and entering the results of those calculations as the field result. It is very important to know that calculated fields are calculated in real time. What does this mean? Well, the value of the calculated field is not stored in the Microsoft Dynamics CRM database. Instead, on retrieve of the record, a Microsoft SQL function is called in the backend and does the calculation and then presented within the form, chart, view, etc. Due to this, calculated fields cannot be used to trigger events such as workflows and plugins. The calculation is done on the server during a retrieve request, so making a change on a form that would influence the calculated field would not show up until you refresh the view or form to force a request to be made again to the server. A calculated field is able to be used in other calculated fields. There's only one thing to watch out for here. There's a hard limit of 5 max chained calculated fields. This is to prevent performance issues. A really important note here is that the calculations are done as the system account. Why is this important? If a user does not have permission for specific data, calculated fields will still show the calculated data because the system account has full permissions within Microsoft Dynamics CRM. This leads us to our next point of field level security. Field level security prevents users without appropriate permissions to see certain data for an entity type. For instance, let's say we have a calculated field of weighted revenue, which takes the estimated revenue and multiplies it by the probability. If a user did not have the permission on estimated revenue due to field level security, that data will not show for the user. However, the calculated field is done by the system account, and the weighted revenue is displayed. If the user knows the formula of the calculated field, they could easily deduce what estimated revenue is and render field level security useless. When using a field that has field level security enabled, the editor will show a warning suggesting to enable field level security for the calculated field due to the specific field being enabled for field security. Lastly, calculated field values are available in the Retrieve plugin pipeline. Post image of entity record update or create contains the calculated attribute value in stage 40. Now that we have seen how calculated fields can be used and the powerful usage of them, let's take a look at some of the limitations or considerations of them. We have already covered a couple of them, but it's helpful to reiterate all of them in one place. Calculated fields are not available as attributes for record field change for workflows. Additionally, trying to set a calculated field within a wait condition will throw an error to the user. Along the lines of plugins, they cannot be used for triggering events either. Calculated fields cannot contain an action with a calculated field being defined. This will create a circular reference and is prohibited within Microsoft Dynamics CRM by presenting an error message to a user. The max character limit for a field is 4,000 characters. If the calculated field exceeds 4,000 characters, the data will be truncated. The thing to note here is that there is no indication that the data has been truncated. Saved queries, charts, and visualizations can have a maximum of 10 unique calculated fields. If a user tries to go over this limit, a generic error could be presented to the user. If a log is available, it would state the exception pretty clearly. Calculated fields are not available within Microsoft Dynamics CRM for Microsoft Office Outlook client while in the offline mode. Those fields will show up as empty while the client is offline. There is a hard limit of 5 max chained calculated fields. This is to prevent performance issues. A calculated field can contain a field from another entity, so this would be touching two entities, the current entity and the parent record. However, a calculated field cannot contain a calculated field from another entity that also contains another field from a different entity, touching 3 entities. So in this example, we have a contact calculated field retrieving the originating lead lookup. Then we have the account calculated field retrieving from the primary contact lookup for that calculated field on the contact. Finally, we have the opportunity trying to set the calculated field to the calculated field of the account, which then results in the error message. If a calculated field references a field from a parental entity, logical field such as an address field, or another calculated field, you cannot sort a view on that field. For example, if you have a calculation on the opportunity entity that references a field on the parent account record, you will not be able to sort a view based on that calculated field. If a calculated field only references fields from the current record, you can sort on that field. For those that are interested in the deeper understanding of what is going on behind the scenes, continue on the architecture part of this training. Otherwise, feel free to move on to the lab for calculated fields and then on to the rollup fields training. The best way to illustrate the architecture for calculated fields is by looking into an on-premises environment. So now that we're back in Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2015, I wanted to quickly review the calculated field that we already created. We already created this new underscore weighted revenue field, and we can see that this is a field type of calculated. Now what I would like to do is open up SQL Management Studio and take a look at this field in more detail. I now have Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio opened, and now what I want to do is take a look at this particular field in more detail. To do that, I'm going to go ahead and expand my database, expand the tables, and what we were looking for was the opportunity. So let's go ahead and go to Opportunity Base. Expand that, and expand columns. Now, let's go ahead and look for the new underscore weighted revenue field. You can see this at the bottom. If I hover over it, or if I look at the right-hand side of it, you can see that the type for this column is computed. This means that data is not stored within this column, that the data from this column is computed. Now, how is that data computed? Well, let's right-click on it and go to Properties. You can see the computed text is being defined by a function, fn underscore udf underscore a GUID. This GUID represents the attribute ID for new weighted revenue. So, how do we know what this function does? We can look at that within the programmability of the database. So let's go ahead and cancel this, and let's go to the programmability, functions, scalar value function. So here's that function that has been defined for the computed text. So to take a look at it, we can right click on it and go to modify. And here we can see what the value is set to. We can see that it's trying to set the value of the variable 4 to variable 2 times variable 3. Variable 2 being the estimated revenue and variable 3 being the probability. So now that I have that defined, let's just take a quick look at how we query the data. So if I do my normal select statement, so I've defined a SQL statement, new underscore weighted revenue from opportunity, and I execute it, it's going to show me the calculated field. Again, it's not stored within the database. This is information that is being calculated by the defined function. Again, it's really important to understand that the data is not available except for on retrieve within Microsoft Dynamics CRM. So now that you know the architecture of calculated fields, let's go ahead and jump into roll-up fields. We can now see how useful calculated fields are. Let's change our focus and look at roll-up fields. Roll-up fields are designed to help users obtain the insights into the data by monitoring key business metrics. A roll-up field contains an aggregate value computed over the records related to a specific record, such as open opportunities in an account, or in more complex scenarios, over data hierarchies. For example, a salesperson may want to know the total open revenue for an account for all of their open opportunities. A service engineer would like to keep track the last time the customer was in for an appointment. A team manager wants to ensure all open queue items for cases have an engineer assigned to them. As a CRM system customizer or administrator, you'll enjoy the benefits of defining these types of calculations within the CRM application. There's no need for additional code development. Roll-up fields are taking an aggregate of a field and rolling it up to the source entity. With this in mind, there are only a few data types that could accomplish this, as seen in this illustration. Just like with calculated fields, once the field type has been set to roll-up, clicking on Edit creates the field. When a roll-up field has been created and defined, dependencies are created for the related entity, attributes used in the filters and aggregated field, and for relationships used. Roll-up fields also have a visual editor. The editor is very similar to that of calculated fields, but the design is more in context with the roll-up field. Let's review what makes up a roll-up field in more detail. We first need to start with a business case scenario. Our account managers want to easily see how many open cases the accounts they manage have. Previously, they could have done this by adding a subgrid on the form and counting the records, but that's not an efficient method. Additionally, it's limited to the form experience. Let's accomplish this task by using roll-up fields. So now that we're back in Microsoft Dynamics CRM, let's go ahead and create a roll-up field by going to Microsoft Dynamics CRM and Settings, Settings, Customizations, and Customize the System. If you remember our scenario, account managers want to see the count of total open cases for their accounts. So this means that we need to create a roll-up field on the account entity. To do that, we'll go ahead and expand Entities, expand Account, and click on Fields. Now that the fields are open, let's go ahead and click on New. Let's set a name for our roll-up field. Let's set a data type for whole number, roll-up, and let's go ahead and click on Edit. Roll-up fields have a base entity where we want the aggregate of the data rolled up to. In this scenario, the base or source entity is account. Now we must roll up information from somewhere. One of the options we have is the ability to use a hierarchical relationship. For the account entity, The hierarchical relationship allows data to be rolled up from an account to parent account. For the current scenario, we won't use a hierarchy. If you're not familiar with hierarchies, please review the Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2015 Hierarchy Visualizations training to get more details about it. If we're not going to use a hierarchical relationship, then we must specify a related entity that we're trying to filter on. For the scenario we discussed, we want to set the related entity to cases. Now you can see we have the option to add filters. If we want only open cases, we want to make sure we set a filter for status equals active. We have the ability to add multiple filter conditions. The logical operator is either AND or it is an OR. Just like calculated fields, business rules, business processes, setting it from one to another will change all of the logical operators. Let's go ahead and cancel out of this. Now we have the final section for aggregation. This is the most important section as this is what the value of the field will show. Since we define a data type of whole number, the aggregate functions we have available to us are sum, max, min, and count. For us, we want a total count of the cases. We now have a defined rollup field for total open cases on the account entity. Another thing I want to point out about the editor is at the bottom here. You'll notice that there's an information bar that essentially tells us that a mass calculation job is being created and scheduled to run 12 hours from when the rollup field is being saved. We're going to cover that a little bit more in detail in the architecture section of this training. Simply know that rollup fields are recalculated or updated with an asynchronous job. So let's go ahead and save this rollup field and add it to the form. Now that I'm on the account form, let's go ahead and open the total open cases field. Let's go ahead and see what this looks like within Microsoft Dynamics CRM. I'm going to go ahead and save and publish the changes. And now I'm going to go ahead and go into an account record. Now that we have the account open, you'll see that total open cases has been defined on the form. You'll also notice that it's a read-only field and that no data has been populated. There's a couple of things to note specifically for rollup fields. One is that rollup fields are identifiable by the calculator icon. Now, if I hover over the field, you can see that the status is yet to be calculated. Well, let's go ahead and calculate this field by clicking on the Recalculate button that sort of looks like the refresh button. You can see after clicking on refresh that the total open cases value is set to 1, and if I hover over it, it has been last updated today at 10:34 a.m. Now that we've seen how to create and the usage of rollup fields, let's go back and talk about them a little bit more in detail. Now that we've seen how rollup fields can be created and defined, it's important to know what aggregate functions are available based on the data type. You can see decimal and whole values support sum, min, max, count. This makes sense as there are numerical values that can do numerical enumerations. Also for currency, we support sum, min, and max. For date, we simply support min and max. One important note to call out for is around currencies. Rollup for currencies happen at the base currency level. The rollup field value will then do currency conversion into the currency of the master record. To touch on some of the additional details about rollup fields, a lot of what has been outlined for calculated fields holds true for rollup fields. For instance, like calculated fields, rollup fields are read-only. We're aggregating data and populating the field with the aggregate of that data. Also, the aggregation of the data for a rollup field is done by the system account. Again, the system account has full permissions within Microsoft Dynamics CRM, so all of the data is rolled up and a user could potentially see more data than they have access to. For instance, you're a user in CRM with restricted security rule that only allows you to see the accounts you own or, as defined in the security rules, user privilege. On the account entity is a hierarchical rollup that is aggregating the sum of the potential revenue for the accounts. Our company works with Contoso, which is an account in CRM. Contoso has sub-accounts for their different divisions, such as Contoso Aeronauticals, Contoso Automotives, and Contoso Nautical. You're the owner of the corporate account, and you can see revenue for Contoso. However, within the rollup field, you see a much higher number. Why? This is because our rollup field is calculating for the sub-accounts as well. Since the calculation is done as a system count, you're able to see all the data being rolled up into the rollup field. Similar to calculated fields, If a user has restricted permissions on a field due to field level security, but does not have restricted permissions on a rollup field that is using the restricted field, that user would be able to see the data. When using a field that has field security enabled, the editor will show a warning suggesting to enable field level security for the rollup field due to the specific field being enabled for field security. Rollup fields have the same behavior as any other attribute type, which includes the support for sorting and filtering. Even though there are a lot of similarities between calculated fields and rollup fields, there are quite a few differences as well. Due to the potential amount of data that may need to be calculated for a rollup field, calculations for the rollup field are done asynchronously. This means that after creating a rollup field, you will not see any data populated for that field. If you review the bottom note of the rollup field editor, it states that a masked calculation job will be scheduled 12 hours after the field is saved. This information is displayed on the rollup editor to let you know when the masked calculation job will run, so you, as a system administrator, can reschedule it in case the automatically scheduled time is not optimal. Since the data is not available right away, what do you do if you need the data now? Rollup fields have the ability to be manually calculated like we've seen. To identify a rollup field within a form, a calculator icon is shown within the field. Then on the right hand side of the rollup field is the recalculate button. The icon looks like that of the refresh icon. Clicking on the recalculate button will force the aggregation of the rollup field to be done. There are a few considerations you should keep in mind when using the online recalculation option. You have to have the right privileges on the entity and write access rights on the records participating in the online recalculation. This option is only available in the online mode for Microsoft Dynamics CRM for Microsoft Office Outlook client. You can't use it while working offline. The maximum number of records for the online recalculation is limited to 50,000 records. In case of the hierarchical rollup, this applies to the related records across the hierarchy. If the limit is exceeded, you see an error message stating calculations can't be performed online because the calculation limit of 50,000 related records has been reached. The maximum hierarchy depth is limited to 10 for online recalculation. If the limit is exceeded, you see an error message. Calculations can't be performed online because the hierarchy depth limit of 10 for the source record has been reached. Additionally, doing aggregation for a record does not update the actual record. The modified on will still show the last time the actual record had been modified, not when the rollup field has been calculated. Let's take a look at a little more details about the rollup field again. Hovering over a rollup field gives you additional information about the last update event for the field. Updates to rollup fields do not cause modified on to be updated for the record. As you can see here, the record was last modified on 9/10/2014. However, the total annual revenue rollup field was last updated on 10/2/2014. When creating rollup fields, two additional fields are created with the rollup field. These are field name underscore date and field name underscore state. These additional fields give the user the ability to know how fresh the data is within the rollup field or if there are any issues. Field name underscore date field contains the date and time the last update was done for that rollup field. The field name underscore state field shows the state of the field. The state of the field is a numeric field and the following values correspond with this status. A value of 0 indicates the field value has yet to be calculated. 1 means it has been calculated for the last update time in the field underscore date field. 2 indicates an overflow error seen here. A value of 3 is sort of a catch value where it failed due to an internal error. The following run of the calculation job will likely fix it. 4 shows that the field value calculation failed because the maximum number of retry attempts to calculate the value was exceeded due to the high number of concurrency or locking conflicts. The retry limit is 3. The maximum hierarchy depth limit for manual calculation is 10. So if a field value calculation exceeds this, it will fail with a state value of 5. If a recursive loop is detected within a hierarchy of the record, it will fail with a value of 6. It's important to understand the various limitations and/or considerations when using and creating rollup fields. Let's cover those now. Rollup fields cannot be used as a workflow event or wait condition. These do not raise the event to trigger workflows. The modified by and modified on fields for the entity are not updated when the rollup field is updated. A maximum of 100 rollup fields can be defined within an organization. Each entity can have no more than 10 rollup fields. A rollup field formula cannot reference another rollup field. A rollup field formula cannot reference complex calculated fields. only calculated fields that reference fields in the same record can be used. A roll-up field formula cannot include records in many-to-many relationships. Only records in one-to-many relationships can be used. The business rules workflows plugins or calculated fields always use the last calculated value of the rollup field. However, plugins have an ability to update the field and get the latest updated value in the pipeline. This is discussed in the SDK section. The rollups are calculated by scheduled system jobs that run asynchronously in the background. You have to be a Microsoft Dynamics CRM administrator to view and manage the rollup jobs. These jobs can be found by navigating to Microsoft Dynamics CRM in Settings, Settings, and System Jobs. Within System Jobs, we'll want to change the view to Recurring System Jobs. Now that we have the Recurring System Jobs view open, let's take a look at the system job types. You can see that we have a couple of different system job types: Mass Calculate Rollup Field and Calculate Rollup Field. We'll cover the differences of these two job types in the architecture section. As a system administrator, you can modify the rollup job reoccurrence pattern, postpone, pause, or resume the rollup job. However, you can't cancel or delete a rollup job. To pause, postpone, resume, or modify the recurrence pattern, select the job, go to More Actions, and choose the action that you want. If we want to modify the start time, we can click on Postpone, and then it allows us to change the time that this job will run. It is recommended that a CRM administrator adjust the start time of mass calculation jobs after the rollup field is created or modified in such a way that it runs during non-operational hours. For example, a good time to run the job can be at midnight to assure efficient processing of the rollup fields. Additionally, if we have recurrent jobs like the calculated rollup fields, we can go ahead and go into the record, click on Actions, and modify recurrence. Let's discuss the architecture in a little bit more detail. For those of you wanting to understand more details of how rollup fields actually work, feel free to continue on through this section where we will discuss the architecture of rollup fields. The first thing to cover is what happens when a rollup field is created. After defining the rollup field and clicking on Save, the formula definition is validated. This rollup field now requires a bootstrap event to populate all of the records with the rollup field data. Next, SDK message processing steps are registered on Create, Update, Delete for the source and target entities that are set within the rollup formula definition. For example, we create a new rollup on the account entity, which is the sum of all opportunity revenue. Doing so registers steps for both the account and opportunity entity. After that, tables and stored procedures are created within the org_mscrm database. Based on the rollup definition, we set the defaults if we can deterministically detect it. Else, we queue a request in rollup job for incremental to process. For instance, let's take the scenario we previously discussed in the create update stage. On the account create, the default for the account.revenue is going to default to 0 since the creation of the account is not going to have any opportunities already associated with it. However, if we change our scenario a little bit by setting the new rollup to be the sum of the account profit record using a hierarchical relationship, the default value will not be set. A bootstrap event occurs after creating and defining the formula definition of a rollup field the first time or making changes to it. Since you're creating or updating a rollup field for an entity, it's necessary for all records of that entity type to be populated with the new or updated data. To do this, it's necessary to create a sort of temp table called the bootstrap tables for each rollup. We'll cover the specific tables here shortly. The calculations for rollup fields are done so using Microsoft SQL stored procedures. Before the calculations can be done, the stored procedures must exist. Stored procedures are created for the bootstrap and incremental operations. Again, we will cover this in more detail shortly. Now that the tables and stored procedures are created, a couple of additional things get set up. The rollup properties tables gets updated to include the new rollup field. A queue is created for async job to process bootstrap and incremental jobs. The bootstrap tables are only used after the creation or the update of the rollup field formula definition. Again, a new formula requires all records within an entity type to be updated with the new data for the rollup field. These tables are created after the rollup formula definition has been initially set and saved. The name of the tables indicate which type of operation is done, as well as the GUID for the attribute. Initially, these tables are empty. The bootstrap job is called Mass Calculate Rollup Field within the system jobs of Microsoft Dynamics CRM. The mass calculate roll field, or commonly known as mass calculation job, will process the calculation for each newly created roll field one at a time. By default, the job will run 12 hours after you created or updated the roll field formula definition. After the job completes, it is automatically scheduled to run in the distant future, approximately in 10 years. If the field is modified, the job resets to run again in 12 hours after the update. The 12-hour delay is needed to ensure that the mass calculation job runs during the non-operational hours of the organization. The mass calculation job will populate the necessary data into these tables. Once the mass calculation job is complete, it will then truncate these tables. So how do these tables get populated? We'll move on to the stored procedures for roll fields. Here you can see that there are 5 different stored procedures used by the Bootstrap and incremental async jobs to process rollups. The first 4 stored procedures are used with the Bootstrap event. The index copy stored procedure is going to populate the rollup Bootstrap source and rollup Bootstrap target tables. The flattened stored procedure is now ordering the source data by depth. If the data is going to be rolled up, it's important to know how the data rolls up. It uses the rollup Bootstrap markers table as a pointer table when populating the rollup Bootstrap table. Now onto how the data is calculated. The source table then gets populated by taking the data from the temp tables and putting it into the actual table. Once the field has been bootstrapped, records may need to have the rollup field data updated. This is done by the calculate rollup fields job. This is a recurring job that does incremental calculations of rollup fields in the existing records for a specified entity. The incremental means that only the rollup fields in the records that were created after the last calculate rollup fields job execution ended, or data has been updated that related to the rollup fields. The default maximum recurrence setting is 1 hour. The job is automatically created when the first rollup field on an entity is created and deleted when the last rollup field is deleted. There are a couple of other tables to discuss here. The first one is rollup job base. This is where the incremental changes are stored for rollup fields. If a record has been created since the Bootstrap job has been done, then it gets populated into this table. Additionally, if a field that relates to a rollup field has been updated for that record, then it gets put into the table as well. Once the entry has been processed by the incremental job or the calculate rollup fields job, it will be removed from the table. If it failed, the status code and retry columns are updated. This table handles all the incremental changes for all rollup fields. The rollup properties base table stores various information about all rollup fields within this table. This should give you an understanding of what is being used when calculating rollup fields and the flow of it all. For you CRM developers, we do have one additional topic to go over within the SDK. For those not trained within the SDK, or this doesn't interest you, feel free to skip this section. Rollup fields have a new message developers can use. We'll review that now. Rollup fields support a new calculate rollup field message developers can use to calculate a rollup attribute value on demand for a single record. This is not available for mass updates of rollup fields. This message is a synchronous operation for just the field identified in the request. If the value of that record is included as part of other rollup fields, the values of those fields will not take the possible value change caused by calling this method into consideration until the regularly scheduled asynchronous jobs that perform those calculations occur. Again, thank you for taking the time to learn about the new calculated rollup fields within Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2015. Please take some time and complete the associated lab to familiarize yourself with this feature in more detail.